Trump ends Kharg Island's immunity after attacks 20 times larger in Iran and puts Tehran before a tough choice. On the night of July 8, 2026, after attacks attributed to Iran against commercial vessels in the Hormuz region, the United States Central Command confirmed a new round of bombings against Iranian military targets on the coast. Trump escalated his rhetoric and stated that every time Iran attacks, the United States will respond 20 times more forcefully.
We simply hit them very hard, and I say we hit them 20 to 1. Every time they hit us, we will hit them 20 times. And we did that last night. They did a little thing today, but it was really retaliation for last night. Actually, they hit 3 boats, not 2. And when they attack, we strike back much harder. They called a short while ago. They want to make a deal, but I don't know if they're worthy or if they'll keep it. That's the issue.
The famous Iranian Kharg Island has become the center of this pressure because it's the lifeline of Iran's oil exports. That's where most of the money that sustains Tehran's machine comes through. Trump isn't just targeting boats, radars, or coastal bases. He's targeting the flow of money, the income, and the regime's sense of security. The question now isn't just whether Iran will sign another agreement. The question is whether it will comply. What is left of Kharg as a safe haven for the regime? Why is Tehran talking about an agreement after challenging Hormuz? How does Trump intend to force Iran to honor what it signs? I'll tell you all about that in a moment. If you like this kind of straightforward and no-nonsense content, consider subscribing because we have videos like this every day. United States forces attacked Iranian military targets between July 7 and 8 with the stated focus on reducing Iran's ability to threaten commercial ships and cyber crews. Many of these were in the Hormuz district. Central Command reported that air defense systems, coastal surveillance structures, missile and drone storage sites, naval capabilities, and military logistics infrastructure along the Iranian coast were targeted. In the previous round, the United States had already struck about 80 military targets, including more than 60 small vessels belonging to the Revolutionary Guard. Washington's reasoning was simple. Iran violated the ceasefire agreement by attacking 3 commercial vessels that were sailing along a vital international route. Trump spoke in Ankara during the NATO summit and said that the initial agreement with Iran was over. He warned that new actions would come and repeated that Tehran can never have a nuclear weapon. The tone was one of maximum pressure. According to him, Iran had called shortly before wanting to make a deal, but the central question remained unresolved. Would the regime honor what it signed or just use the paper to buy time? That's where Kharg comes in as a key piece. Kharg Island is located in the Persian Gulf and serves as Iran's main crude oil export terminal. Experts point out that it accounts for about 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. That's why there are threats. A threat against Kharg carries more weight than an ordinary threat.
This is part of it. It's about finishing the job. The president wants to finish the job. What he's doing is attacking their entire energy sector. This is basically about collapsing Iran's capacity to produce. That's why they hit Kharg yesterday while we were on the air. Remember that they did this, and there will probably be more attacks against Kharg, I suspect. And that's also why Trump is going after the actual transportation of oil, not just possibly shutting down the coast, but also obviously the Belt and Road Railway. That railway really kept Iran's energy production running. Obviously, they could produce at least a limited amount during the war, and at least they knew they could export through that railway. Trump wants to put an end to this, and that's it that they are doing.
It's not just about hitting an isolated target, it's about putting Tehran's economic lifeline under direct pressure. Trump had already threatened to take control of Kharg and other points of Iran's oil and gas infrastructure. Now, with new rounds of attacks on the coast, and with the crisis in Hormuz returning to the center of the war, that threat no longer seems like just a campaign speech. If Iran tries to use civilian ships as a tool for blackmail, the United States will attack the assets that give the regime money and mobility. The economic blow came along with it. The White House revoked the temporary waivers that allowed Iran to sell oil under the Memorandum of Understanding signed weeks earlier. This measure hits Tehran at another sensitive point because many companies might even want to do business with Iran. But they back off when they see the risk of sanctions, financial blockades, and American punishments. Bombing scares people for a few hours. Sanctions block businesses, banks, ships, buyers, and contracts for much longer. Stephen Hilton Daly, a former member of United States Army intelligence, pointed out exactly this deeper side of the crisis. For him, the airstrikes make headlines, but the removal of oil waivers may be the hardest blow to absorb. The military campaign has its limits. The economic campaign keeps applying pressure without needing explosions every night.
The activity of Zuwara's Air Force in these countries. Now, are these attacks being used specifically to target Iran? I mean, we won't know. This happens behind closed doors and in classified environments. We don't know for sure, but by analyzing flight radar data, you can see that tanker aircraft and drones are still taking off from these areas. It's very interesting answering your question, why is it always Kuwait, Bahrain, Kuwait, Bahrain? The only thing that really makes sense to me is that in the case of Iran, we can argue that maybe they're making progress in diplomatic negotiations with the United Arab Emirates. The other point is that, in my opinion, there's another argument to consider. Furthermore, from the Iranian point of view, especially considering how the United States has carried out much broader and more extensive attacks in the last 48 hours, the Iranians either don't have the desire, or maybe I wouldn't even say the capability, but rather the desire to match that. And that's it. For them, carrying out attacks against targets in Bahrain gives them the victory they need from a symbolic point of view, regardless of effectiveness. I'm surprised that even after 2 days of these large-scale attacks, we still haven't seen attacks against the United Arab Emirates or against Saudi Arabia.
The White House is also preparing for an exchange of fire that could last days, weeks, or even longer, depending on Tehran's decisions in the Strait of Hormuz. American officials say that the duration of the crisis depends on Iranian behavior toward commercial ships. In other words, Trump put the ball in Iran's court. If they stop, it opens space for talks. If they continue, the punishment remains. Iranian officials classified the American attacks as aggression and stated that no military pressure will force the regime to give up its national interests. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, one of the central figures in the negotiations, accused Washington of breaking promises and stated that the Strait of Hormuz will only be reopened on terms set by Iran. It's a war over routes, fees, authorization, and control. Tehran also demonstrated strength by attacking U.S. positions in Bahrain and deployments. Americanas em Bahrein e Kuwait, according to reports released in Bahrain and Kuwait. If Iran responds by putting bases, ships, and trade routes under threat, Washington gains justification to hit harder and cut off more money. Cenk Uygur assessed that the war could end up strengthening the Iranian leadership at home because closed regimes often use external attacks as propaganda for resistance.
But more importantly, I don't want that regime in Iran to be in charge. I don't want to do it the way, the stupid way that Israel wants, which is to kill everyone, send in ground troops, and then assassinate until they get regime change. No, 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 no. I'm totally against that. But I would really love to see an organic transformation of character in Iran. And unfortunately, this war has made that much more difficult.
Exactly.
That's more important than their view of America right now. That made them rally around the flag. It strengthened the regime 1,000 times more, and it looks like they're about to kind of win a war against the United States and Israel, which is going to make them super popular. So, this has been the dumbest and most counterproductive war you could imagine.
This warning doesn't take away from the weight of the American response, but it does show a real trap. When the regime turns external pressure into a survival narrative, it tries to hide its own mistakes behind the national flag. That's why Trump tries to combine two fronts: military force to impose immediate costs and economic pressure to sap the regime's strength. Brandon Weichert also interpreted the attacks as part of a larger strategy against Iran's energy sector. In his assessment, Kharg was just the symbolic beginning, because the goal is to hit Iran's energy supply chain at multiple levels: coastline, export, transportation, railways, and buyers.
Because I don't think that, look, if he doesn't know how he got to this point, which he really seems not to understand, it's quite surprising to imagine that he'll have any plan to get off this path. That's the kind of path that's hardest to abandon. That was, I think I've told you this before, but Herman Kahn, who was the great nuclear war theorist in the 60s, he referred to something like this as senseless orgasm. Basically, once you start, everything just keeps going and you can't stop until it's basically completely consumed. And this isn't being controlled by disciplined practitioners, of diplomacy. All of this is in the hands of a bunch of amateurs who actually despise expertise. So that's not a good position for the United States to be in. So I think his theory is escalate to de-escalate.
The interpretation is simple. Oil production doesn't go down if the regime can't sell, transport, or receive the money. Reports about damage to a railway connection associated with the corridor between Iran and China fit into this logic. Weichert's interpretation is that Washington is looking beyond the ports. It is observing the path of oil, the railways, the alternative routes, and the points that connect Tehran to strategic buyers. How do you sustain the machine if the outflow starts to stall? Trump's calculation seems to be to apply pressure without necessarily announcing a large-scale ground occupation. An operation of this kind would require much more ammunition, troops, and risk. The current phase seems aimed at breaking capabilities, imposing costs, and forcing Tehran back to the table in a weaker position. Meanwhile, a record seizure of 6.68 tons of cocaine by El Salvador, with support from United States forces and Colombian authorities, underscores another aspect of the same international environment. Washington is using force, intelligence, and cooperation to pressure illegal networks and hostile governments along different routes. In the Pacific, the response was against drug trafficking. In the Gulf, the response is against Iran's maritime blackmail. The logic is similar. Control the routes, cut off the money, and leave fewer resources for groups that thrive on disorder. If Iran asks for an agreement after attacking ships, who can guarantee it won't do it again when it needs an advantage? The energy market has already felt the impact. The price of oil went up with the new escalation, and ships started to reconsider crossing through Hormuz. For Trump, this increases the urgency to keep the route open. For Iran, it increases the value of the threat. The difference is that the United States now shows a willingness to attack not only the hand that fires, but also the pocket that supports that hand. Kharg became a symbol because it concentrates what the Iranian regime most needs to protect: money, oil, and the appearance of control. Hormuz became a symbol because it shows what the world cannot leave in the hands of Tehran: the freedom of navigation through a global artery. Thank you very much for watching this video until the end. Support our project and contribute financially using the Pix key shown on your screen. We are an independent channel focused on bringing you the truth. Your contribution helps us stay on our feet.